Lena Bennett had always been the quiet type, the kind of woman who easily faded into the background of her small town, known more for her gentle nature and impeccable politeness than for any drama or intrigue. To those who knew her from the outside, she was a kind-hearted woman, a steady presence in a world of transient connections. Her life in Fairhaven was simple and uneventful, or so it seemed, a life built around routine and the quiet comfort of familiarity. She worked at the local flower shop, a small place tucked into the corner of the main square, where she tended to the plants with meticulous care and exchanged pleasantries with the regular customers who stopped by to purchase a bouquet or to chat about the weather. Lena had lived in Fairhaven her whole life, and although she had once dreamed of leaving, of chasing something bigger, life had a way of settling into grooves so deep they felt impossible to climb out of. She wasn't unhappy exactly, she was content. Or at least she had been. But everything changed 5 years ago, and since then, the town of Fairhaven had not known the real Lena Bennett. 5 years ago, her life had taken a sharp turn, one she hadn't seen coming, and ever since, she had been living in the shadows of that betrayal. It wasn't the sort of betrayal that sparked headlines or ignited public outrage. It was quiet, personal, and devastating in a way that left no obvious scars. It had all started with James Hadley, the man she had once loved with all her heart. James had been the love of her life, or so she'd thought. He was everything she had ever wanted: charming, ambitious, a man with a future bright enough to match her own dreams. They had met during the Fairhaven Summer Festival, a town tradition that brought together locals and tourists alike for a week of music, food, and fireworks. Lena, always shy, had been coaxed into attending by her best friend Clara, who had insisted that they enjoy the festival together, just as they had every year since they were children. Clara was the opposite of Lena in almost every way: vivacious, outgoing, always the center of attention, but their friendship had always been the steady kind, built on years of shared memories and trust. That summer night had seemed magical at the time. The streets were strung with twinkling lights, the air warm with the promise of adventure, and the smell of funnel cakes and freshly popped corn filled the air. Lena had never been one for crowds, but Clara had dragged her from booth to booth, laughing and teasing her in the way only a best friend could. It was then, standing by the carousel, that she had first met James. He had been in town for a new project, a promising young architect fresh out of graduate school, eager to make a name for himself. Lena had been instantly drawn to him, and to her surprise, he had seemed just as captivated by her. He had spent the entire evening by her side, talking about his dreams, about his plans for the future, about the life he envisioned in a small town like Fairhaven. That night, as they walked along the riverbank under the stars, she had felt a spark she hadn't known existed within her, and by the end of the festival, they were inseparable. Their relationship had moved quickly, but it had felt right. James had swept her off her feet with his charm, his ambition, and his unwavering confidence in their future together. They had talked about marriage, about building a life together, and about the house by the river they would one day buy, where they would raise a family. Lena had never been more certain of anything in her life. And when James had proposed to her in the small garden behind her parents' house, she had said yes without hesitation, her heart full of love and hope for the life they would build together. But dreams have a way of unraveling when reality sets in, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. James's career started to take off, and with it came long hours at work, late nights at the office, and a growing distance between them. At first, Lena had tried to be understanding. She had told herself that this was just a phase, that James was working hard to secure their future, that the stress of his job was the reason for his absence, both physical and emotional. But as the months dragged on, the distance only grew. He stopped looking at her with the same warmth, stopped asking about her day, stopped holding her close the way he used to. His affection became absent-minded, his words more mechanical, and Lena found herself alone more often than not, wondering where the man she had fallen in love with had gone. The truth, when it finally came, was worse than she had imagined. It had come in the form of a lipstick-stained napkin tucked carelessly into the pocket of his jacket, an unfamiliar shade of red, a color Lena never wore. Her heart had sunk when she found it, a cold, hard pit of dread forming in her stomach as she stood there in their kitchen, the sound of the wine outside the only noise breaking the suffocating silence. When she confronted James that night, she had hoped foolishly that there would be some explanation, some misunderstanding that would put her fears to rest. But his lie had been weak, half-hearted, and in that moment, she had known the truth. He had been unfaithful, and her entire world had shifted on its axis. But what had truly broken her wasn't James's infidelity. It was the realization that the other woman, the woman he had been seeing behind her back for months, was none other than Clara, her best friend, the person she had trusted above all others. The betrayal had cut deeper than any wound she could have imagined. Clara, who had been by her side through every joy and heartache, who had laughed with her, cried with her, and promised to always be there for her. Clara, who had been like a sister to her, had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. The shock of it had left her numb, and in the weeks that followed, Lena had retreated into herself, unable to face the world, unable to face the two people who had shattered her trust so completely. Fairhaven, with its small-town charm and close-knit community, had quickly become a prison of whispers and stolen glances. The gossip had spread like wildfire, and soon everyone knew about James and Clara's affair. But Lena had refused to give the town what it wanted. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't beg for sympathy. Instead, she put on a brave face, kept her head down, and buried her pain deep inside, locking it away where no one could reach it. She continued working at the flower shop, continued going about her daily routine as if nothing had happened, as if the life she had envisioned for herself hadn't been ripped away in a single moment of betrayal. But beneath the surface, something dark had begun to grow. The sadness that had once consumed her slowly twisted into something else, something colder, sharper, more dangerous. Lena's heart hardened, and the fire that burned within her wasn't one of passion or love. It was the slow, smoldering embers of revenge. For a long time, Lena didn't know what form her revenge would take. She wasn't the kind of person who acted impulsively, who let her emotions dictate her actions. No, Lena was patient. She knew that revenge, real revenge, wasn't about making a scene or causing a public spectacle. It was about precision, about waiting for the right moment, about letting the pieces fall into place exactly as they should. And so she waited. She watched. She bided her time. James and Clara, for their part, seemed completely unbothered by the chaos they had caused. After the dust settled, they began flaunting their relationship around town, as if nothing had happened, as if their betrayal had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of their lives. They moved in together, buying the house by the river that Lena and James had once dreamed of calling their own. They hosted dinner parties, attended town events as a couple, and acted as if they were the golden pair of Fairhaven, untouchable by the consequences of their actions. And Lena watched it all unfold with a calmness that surprised even her. She let them have their moment in the sun, let them believe that they had won, all the while plotting their downfall with the kind of cold, methodical precision that only comes from a deep and enduring sense of betrayal. Lena knew James well better than anyone, perhaps. She knew his weaknesses, his ambitions, and most importantly, his blind spots. James had always been ambitious, always reaching for the next rung on the ladder, never satisfied with what he had. It was one of the things that had drawn Lena to him in the first place, his drive, his passion. But it was also the thing that would lead to his downfall. Over the years, James's career as an architect had flourished. He had become the go-to designer for the town's most prominent projects, his reputation growing with each new success. But with that success came arrogance, and with that arrogance came carelessness. James had begun to cut corners, to make deals that weren't entirely above board, all in the name of advancing his career. And Clara, ever eager to ride the wave of his success, had turned a blind eye to the more questionable aspects of his business dealings. Lena had seen it all, had quietly gathered every piece of information she could about James's dealings, his financials, his personal life. She had become a master of observation, picking up on the smallest details, the subtle shifts in conversations, the things people didn't say but that hung in the air like unspoken truths. She had spent years collecting every bit of dirt she could on James, every misstep, every shady deal, every affair he had tried to cover up. And when the time was right, she began to set her plan into motion. It started small, almost imperceptibly. Lena began to quietly re-establish her connections in town, not through grand gestures, but through small, seemingly insignificant favors. She helped the mayor's wife with her garden, offered to lend a hand to the local librarian with archiving old documents, attended town council meetings where she volunteered her free time. She made herself indispensable in ways that were subtle but effective, and slowly, without anyone realizing it, she began to build a network of quiet influence. She never spoke ill of James or Clara, never let on that she harbored any ill will. But behind the scenes, she was planting seeds of doubt, quietly guiding conversations in such a way that people began to question things on their own, without ever suspecting that Lena was the one pulling the strings. James, always ambitious, had begun eyeing a seat on the town council. It was the next logical step in his career, a position that would give him even more influence, more power. Clara, too, was eager for the social elevation it would bring, envisioning herself as the wife of a prominent figure, hosting lavish parties and rubbing elbows with the town's elite. But Lena had other plans. By the time James officially announced his candidacy, she had already laid the groundwork for his downfall. She had gathered enough dirt on him to sink his campaign, and with the quiet support of her network, she began to leak the information at just the right moments. It wasn't long before rumors began to swirl. At first, they were small whispers about financial discrepancies in his firm, questions about the integrity of his building projects. But as the election neared, the whispers grew louder, and soon they reached the ears of the local media. An investigative reporter, one of Lena's quiet allies, began digging into James's past and published a scathing article that exposed his dubious business practices and painted him as a man unfit for public office. The town, once enamored with him, turned cold. His clients began to pull out of deals, his reputation in tatters, and his campaign collapsed under the weight of the scandal. Clara, ever the social climber, had tied her future to James's success, and when it fell apart, so did her carefully curated life. The strain on their relationship became unbearable, and the cracks began to show. Clara grew suspicious of James's past infidelities, suspecting there had been more than just the one with her. Their fights became public, their once perfect life unraveling for all to see. It wasn't long before Clara packed her bags and left him, moving out of the house by the river that had once been Lena's dream. James, disgraced and alone, had no one to turn to. He had burned too many bridges, trusted too few people, and when he finally realized what had happened, it was too late. He knew, deep down, that Lena had been behind it all, but he couldn't prove it. Lena had been too careful, too patient, too methodical in her execution. There was no evidence to tie her to his downfall, no proof of her involvement. And that, Lena thought, was the sweetest part of all. She never gloated, never sought out James or Clara to confront them. She didn't need to. The satisfaction of watching them destroy themselves, of seeing their lives crumble under the weight of their own choices, was enough. Lena had learned long ago that revenge wasn't about making a scene. It was about patience, about precision, about waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, as she stood on the riverbank, looking out at the house that had once been the symbol of her future, she felt nothing but a quiet, cold satisfaction. The sun was setting over Fairhaven, casting a golden glow across the water, and for the first time in years, Lena felt at peace. The fire that had burned within her for so long had finally been extinguished, and in its place was a calm, steady resolve. She had taken back the power that had been stolen from her, had restored balance to her world. And as the last light of day faded into the horizon, Lena turned away from the river, leaving behind the ghosts of her past.